I could have sworn I saw her pupils constrict to nearly match my own, if only for a second. I wish I could say she was cute, sleeping in my arms, but her lidless eyes stared upwards hauntingly, and her body felt dead, stiff and rigid. Rather than a girl, she looked more like a hollow carcass, harsh lacerations faintly visible all across her dead gray skin, stretched horribly tight around her disjointed form. Her paralyzed muscles rendered her position unbending and taut, like a die-cast mold. I didn't even think she was asleep for a while. I just figured she was being quiet or was deep in thought. However, it was now perfectly clear that she was knocked out cold. She lay absolutely still, her breathing slow and steady. Her heart, usually beating more than 3 times a second, had dramatically slowed to a pulse far slower than my own. I whispered to her quietly, asking if she was awake, but her cold gray lips lay still. She didn't respond. Before she slipped into this state, I had rambled for what felt like forever. I mostly talked about my life in the outside world, although I'm sure she would have been just as content with any topic. I tried to keep the subject happy, but I became slightly troubled at first, and then downright distraught as I realized that with each new mention of my life and the town, I was merely painting a picture of darkness. Our town had a gloomy and troubled past. Tragedies happened like a reoccurring sickness around here. I found myself leaving out more details than I had ever wanted to think about. Sure, the scenery was pretty, if you didn't look at the horribly bald landscape to the southwest, still charred black from the fire after all these years, the memorials of the 20 dead still standing tall. Sure, the weather was nice here, if you didn't consider the intense rain of a few years back that claimed yet more lives with heavy flooding. Sure, school was fun, if you didn't count the massacre in the middle school 4 years ago. No survivors in the 8th grade classroom where it originated. This was by far the most scarring event in recent history, and after that, even more than before, the town was plunged into a horrible blackness, little less than a murky pool of blank stares and heart-wrenchingly pale faces. The community was always masquerading around with disguises, trying to hide their sunken forms and hollow eyes. An ever-present out-of-place smile forced its way onto the faces of passerbys as they tried to pretend that loss didn't strangle the life out of this town the more it tried to breathe. Sure, my family was great. Myself an only child. My father too wrapped up in work to even know I was there, slowly killing himself with distractions before he would admit the loss of my mother had torn out something he could never replace. Despite what I told people, this was not my first time living in Colorado. I had lived with both my parents in this town before. My mother had always loved teaching. The fact that she happened to teach 8th grade and that fucking psychopath riddled her dreams with molten lead before turning the barrel on her was enough to make life seem like a big fucking joke. I never liked being taught by my own mother, but the fact that I happened to be sick on that one day was something I knew I would regret for the rest of my life. My friends all gone in the blink of an eye. The people I had grown up with, nothing more than names in the newspaper now. I wished for the longest time that I had attended that day. Life hardly seemed worth living when you woke up to police at your door informing you that you were now more alone than you ever even thought possible. After this, my father, with the best intentions in mind, sent me away to live with my grandfather in New York, where I spent the next 3 years. He thought the distance would help, but he dealt with the heartbreak in a much more self-destructive manner. He became obsessive over his work. He already wasted his life doing what he did before the incident, but after the fact he became downright possessed, never sleeping for days and weeks at a time. I wasn't even sure what he did for a job, but I knew he was just using it to push the pain out of his mind. No amount of convincing would get him to leave the town, however, and after my grandfather passed last year, I found myself sucked back to this fucking place. I pretended as if it was the first time I had set foot in such a haunted location. I didn't seek out anyone I knew from before. I avoided them like the plague. Anything I could do to make it seem different from before was more than welcome. I told everyone I met that this was my first time here. Anything helped me to hold on to my delusional mentality that things would be different this time. Several weeks after returning, I found that ghost town staring me down. It had clearly been there before, for quite a while, but I had only become so curious in it upon my return, as I was so desperately looking for something near the town that I hadn't seen before, something new, something that'd take my mind off the tragedy of before. What good that turned out to be. I tried to mention what my house was like, but found that, once again, I didn't have the strength to describe it to her. Hauntingly empty. My father's obsessive work gained him enough money to buy the mansion-like house my mother had always dreamed of, but he never got the chance he and my mother had envisioned to fill it with kids. It was just me in all those empty rooms, staring down the bare hallways with no family portraits adorning the walls, not an ounce of cheer anywhere to be found, nothing to distract me from the loneliness. It may have been nice to talk to the girl about this. I had never told anyone before about what I was going through, and it may have been nice to finally say some of it out loud. She would have listened for sure, more intently than any normal person ever could, but I somehow didn't feel like I was at liberty to complain in her presence. I told her my name eventually, John Matthews. After I said this and looked down at her for some sort of reaction, her face grew incredibly frustrated and she muttered out, "I don't like that name." Her face became lost in a sort of enraged confusion. Her pupils dilated, the color draining from her face. I scoffed, honestly a little hurt, but when I went to respond, I found that she had slipped into the sleep-like state she was currently in. It was strange. Up until that point, she had been listening so incredibly intently. Her lapse in consciousness was rather sudden and startling at first. Her strange reaction to my name troubled me, and although I asked why she hated it so much, she didn't respond. I sighed and hoped that when she woke, I could get some sort of explanation from her. I was having extreme difficulty navigating in the darkness, having to move agonizingly slowly to avoid stumbling over fallen trees or bushes. It certainly didn't help that the creature weighed more than I thought possible. More than once I nearly tripped over the chains dragging past my feet. the chain snaking out from the same girl I was convinced would telekinetically gut me if I accidentally startled her awake. And so I continued on, carrying a murderous weapon cradled in my arms out of some sense of misplaced chivalry I had conjured up. I had hoped it would get her to want to kill me a little bit less. That was honestly my main goal for the foreseeable future. The way her eyes widened when I offered to carry her, though, saying that I was worried she would burn her legs too much moving the way she did. The way a light, embarrassed smile curled the corners of her cold gray lips. It made my heart flip, and for the first time since this whole incident started, I felt as if I had done something right. I wasn't sure how far Penny and I had run into the mountains, but I knew I couldn't backtrack or go anywhere near that facility again, so the distance was at least tripled to find my way back to my car. It would consist of climbing ridges and moving up and down mountains, the changes in elevation adding even more to the expected time. Thankfully, courtesy of my paranoid mess of a brain, I had parked far away and out of sight from the ghost town I now knew encircled that horrible secretive chrome facility. Chances were good that my car would still be there and no one would have been able to link it to me or my friend's presence in that place. It was parked in a neighborhood, thus not appearing out of place. Who would have thought such an unreasonably paranoid act would have become so necessary? I was suddenly startled out of my thoughts as something faintly glinted up ahead in the distant trees. Too stupid and too naive, I thought it might be the headlight of a passing car, until I heard the voices and radio garble. Freezing in my tracks, I quickly ducked behind a tree and laid the girl down on the ground, already hearing footsteps approaching, dogs beginning to bark. "Hey, hey, hey!" I whispered harshly. "Hey, wake up!" It took all of my willpower to restrain myself from shaking her. Her eyes flicked to me. "I wasn't sleeping, John," she said. "I don't sleep." Brushing that off, too panicked to even care, I quietly hissed, "There are gunmen coming this way right now. What do we do?" "How many?" she asked. I don't know," I stammered. "At least 20. Her face grew puzzled. Why would they send so few? "What?" I hushed. "So few? They've got, automatic weapons and bulletproof vests." "They know such a small number couldn't even contend," she pondered, entirely dismissing me. "So why send out teams in that size? What are they trying to accomplish?" "I don't know," I said, flinching as I heard the shuffling of leaves, "but we don't have time to think about that. We have to get out of here." "No," she said, her iris being consumed by her pupil. Her haunting form rose to its feet like a damaged figurine controlled by a puppeteer. In the next second, a large black dog came tearing over the hill, slobber dripping from its jowls as it barked. It stopped when it saw her, its back bristling and its ears dropping flat as it snarled and gnashed its teeth. Its black eyes glanced at me and my heart stopped in terror. The girl paid it no mind, however, instead stumbling out into the open and focusing on the crest of the hill where voices could be heard shouting, approaching rapidly. Another dog appeared over the crest before stopping and backpedaling slightly, obviously having been trained to stay as far away as possible. The girl's chains splayed out of her back, snaking in every direction and reaching close to 15 feet long as she stood emotionless. I could hear the gut-wrenching sounds of her insides churning and shifting as the metal erupted outwards. The horrific barbs raised above her head in a choreographed manner, the metal screaming. The first 3 men reached the top of the hill. Upon seeing her standing unfazed, they halted in their tracks, fingers on their triggers. Before I could blink, the air howled with percussive shockwaves as the men pumped rounds at the girl's ghoulish form. I thought I was prepared for it to happen after her explanation, but witnessing the metal slugs erupt out the back of the men's own skulls seconds after they pulled the trigger was more than I could take. The air around the creature arced with distortive abrasions, and the men's faces had no time to showcase their horror before the backs of their heads exploded outwards. Crimson blood spread out in horrible sticky patterns as the men's bodies dropped like broken dolls. The girl's slumped posture made her appearance all the more ghastly as she began steadily walking headlong, gazing straight ahead, expressionless. Her chains whipped around too fast to even see. Horrific, blurry streaks of blackness tore the already dead men to pieces, their torsos cleaved from their legs, their hands holding the guns hacked off before they even hit the cold floor. The rest of the team below began frantically spraying bullets, the terror at seeing her approach clearly overriding common sense telling them not to shoot. Maybe they forgot in their fear, or maybe they just wanted it to be over faster, but either way the result of their actions was all too familiar. As the woods were painted with the men's own blood, the creature softly curled its hands into a ball in front of it, its fingers clawing together like someone experiencing a seizure, but her face just erupted in a horrid smile, her dry skin splitting as the diseased grin ate away at her ghastly face. Several men dropped their weapons in horror, turning to dash off into the woods when they realized how futile their attempt was. The girl stooped down as she passed a corpse, picking up a rifle. As she continued on her way and raised the weapon to her eye line, one of the chains slashed the corpse's head off for good measure. Spraying not but a few bullets each time and with unreal precision, the girl gunned down the runaways as they tried to flee. Their runs quickly devolved into tumbles, and those brave enough to stay and fight were now within range of the girl's chains, and their boiled blood erupted into the air as they fell to pieces. Between the ear-shattering rattle of gunfire, I could clearly hear a demented, strained hissing sound cutting into the air. My heart lurched in fear as I realized what it was. Laughter. That was the creature's laughter. Her mouth had erupted open, saliva like spider webs inside as her bone-chilling rasping grew more and more intense. Her eyes darted between the shredded body parts with wild glee as entrails danced in the air around her. I watched, frozen in terror, as even those entirely unarmed and trying desperately to turn and flee screamed in agony as the blistering metal threaded its way through their fleshy bodies and dragged them back towards the creature. Their hands clawed at the ground, their fingernails splintering before the leaves were splatter-painted red as the shrieking metal squirmed its way to their necks from the inside and ruptured outwards. The slashing technique had worked fine to simply dismember them. The fact that she was now getting imaginative with their deaths made my skin crawl. The way she began to keep them alive for longer was hardly efficient. The way she allowed them to writhe in agony before slowly boring to the base of their spine showed all too clearly that she was deriving sick enjoyment from this. My stomach churned and knotted up as I watched surreal fear burst forth across the men's faces as the creature approached them. The same thing whose hand I had held, the same thing I had looked at with a smile not minutes ago. Between our two entirely polar reactions, someone was clearly in the wrong. But as the men's vertebrae were forced into the open and they fell to fragments, it was hard to imagine that their reactions were the ones that were off. Even more sickening was how their fear was mixed with confusion, and how they were so utterly unprepared for this situation. Surely they knew what this creature could do. They had trained it, for God's sake. How could a team meant to stop her be so helplessly outmatched and use tactics that would never work? How the hell could they have not seen this coming? Why didn't they have a plan for this? The last runaway to be gunned down screamed into an earpiece, "What is this? It didn't work!" His leg was shattered by a bullet, and the next two impacted his neck and temple before he even hit the ground. I felt faint, my body numb from what I had just witnessed. The creature continued to walk around, her snaking chain slashing off the heads of the attackers as she wove through their bodies. I had to hold back the urge to vomit. Many of the corpses lay in mangled pieces, organs spilling out onto the cold ground. What scared me more than anything, however, was how easily I had forgotten what that girl truly was. I had pretended to know, pretended to have it in the back of my mind as I spoke with her about trivial things. But how wrong I was. As she dropped the gun and started back up the hill, walking towards me, panic seized my heart. Her chain still hovered in the air, splayed out like iron wings behind her. Her iris was black, her face emotionless again as her twisted grin slowly dissolved away. As I scrambled to my feet in a panic, I knew I had been tricking myself all along. This wasn't a girl, not a human. This creature was a killing machine. The thing walking towards me now was not something I could let live. It could massacre entire cities if left alone. What the hell was I doing helping it? As it approached me, I tried to will myself to turn and run, but its eyes were locked on me and my knees shook. I was frozen in terror. I could hardly even breathe. It was now close enough that I was clearly in range of its chains, and I could already imagine the searing heat I would feel as I hacked my head off with one sweep, as that warped smile distorted the creature's face. It finally stopped directly in front of me, chains slithering in the air. I stared at it, unable to hide the terror I felt as my muscles tensed. "We have to go," it stated coldly. "They'll all swarm here." Its face was splattered with blood, its black pupils pulsing slightly. I couldn't speak, my mouth was too dry. I slowly nodded okay, but didn't move a muscle until the creature slightly shifted its weight and I flinched backwards, feeling sick with terror. It stood in front of me, its face slowly growing irritated. The high-pitched ring of its chains grew louder and louder, as if they were about to slash me in half. "What?" the creature said, its tone harsh and impatient. The chains were now glowing red-hot, vibrating so fast their outlines blurred in my vision. The blood on her face slowly snaked into the air as if it was suspended in zero gravity. I quickly realized that she was controlling it, moving it away from herself, and the droplets quickly fell away to the ground. After several seconds, her face was clean, and the chain suddenly stopped moving, dropping lifelessly to the ground. The glowing metal sizzled violently against the wet leaves. "Cleaning," the creature said at seeing my terrified face staring at the metal. "Vaporizing the blood off. Otherwise they'll get rusty." I said nothing, my panic not lessening in the slightest at her comment. Although she clearly had no intention of killing me, the fact that I still felt deathly lightheaded with fear told me what I had been truly thinking during the bloodbath of just minutes ago. I wasn't scared of the creature, and the sickness I felt wasn't because I was afraid for my own life or the lives of the militia. The graphic nature of the scene made me queasy and terrified, but I largely felt those emotions in an entirely different sense. I felt utterly sick because I was afraid her actions showed just how horribly corrupt her mind was. I was so completely terrified that if she was allowed to continue killing as she did, the light flicker of humanity burning faintly inside of her would be snuffed out for good. I could tell she was already a broken shell of a person, her conscience twisted to hideous extents, perhaps beyond repair. The facility she was confined in had undoubtedly tried every possible thing to break her mind. Each and every fucking day must have been more than anyone could take. And yet the way she had talked with me before told me that this girl had managed to hold on to some small tattered shred of sanity. This wasn't some creature capable of supernatural willpower and strength. This was a goddamn human being. In the short time we had been together, she had already opened up so much, managed to take what scrap of humanity she had left and let it grow. The fear I felt was because in the moments when she hacked those men to fragments, that fragile light flickering faintly in her chest had gone utterly dark. I watched the smoke from the extinguished flame clamber softly into the air as that deranged smile erupted out across her face. I swore I could hear the distant sound of barking. My mind went into overdrive trying to come up with a plan. I could maybe stall the creature long enough here to allow the next militia to find us and take her out. That thought quickly dissolved, however, as I realized that if the next team was anything like the last, all that would result was more bloodshed. They wouldn't even be able to touch her. Allowing them to find us would just mean I had condemned more people to death. More than that, though, allowing them to catch us would only mean that the creature could kill again. I was never going to let her do that. Never again. I could still fix this. I looked at the corpse standing in front of me, black hair lightly swaying in the light wind that carried the scent of death. I took a deep breath, the air vibrating in my shaking lungs. "We need to go," I slowly choked out. "I already said that," the creature said, her face flushing red and becoming pouty as she slowly brought her hands together sheepishly. Uncharacteristic nervousness spread across the creature's face and it cast its eyes down to the ground. "Could you, maybe," it stammered, pausing uncertainly, "carry me again?" My eyes widened and my heart lurched as I felt it grow ill. "I really liked that," the creature stammered. "Did it bother you?" I looked at it, my wobbling heart beating abnormally. How could this thing pull out such a personality after what it had just done? It gave me hope that maybe all wasn't lost, but more than that, it concerned me how fast she could flip between the two personas. "Besides," it continued, lifting its gaze excitedly as if coming up with something good, "besides, I can only propel myself forwards effectively in short bursts. I haven't really learned to run with my paralysis yet." A howl split through the distant air, echoing through the surrounding mountains. My resolve from earlier still held. Shoving my way past her, I stooped down and grabbed an assault rifle in my hand. I had to cover my mouth and I dry heaved into my hands as I stepped over the disgusting smoldering heaps, sopping with blood and intestinal fluids. "What are you?" the girl stammered slowly. I knew I was being overdramatic. I knew this wouldn't change anything. I didn't even know how to operate a damn gun. I knew full well that, if it came down to it, I wouldn't be able to will myself to take the life of another human being. Despite all this, there was no way I was going to let that creature kill again. I couldn't expect the militias to understand that, however. They would fire on us all the same, and someone would have to fight back. I knew I wouldn't even be able to face them if such a scenario happened, but for now at least, I could trick myself into thinking there was an alternative to the creature slowly tearing them apart. Nothing, I sighed in my panic, turning my back to the creature, kneeling down. Hop on. Seconds later, I was sprinting with all my strength. The light had improved, the sun peeking over the horizon, and so I was able to weave effectively through the trees now. As we ran, I realized I could see the 2 black dogs from before disappearing into the woods, probably running back to the facility. You didn't kill the dogs. I like dogs, she said softly. I found myself giving a light smile. You know, I said, changing the subject. That whole thing about not actually being asleep? Yeah, I don't buy it. I think you're just too embarrassed to admit that you fell asleep in my arms. No, she replied. I'm not lying. Do you think something like me would go into such a vulnerable state as sleep? In the state I was in, only various sections of my brain lose operation at any given time, only certain senses being offline for short intervals, never more than one at a time. I'm not sure if I can actually go to sleep, but this method is more effective and takes less time anyway. She fell silent for a little bit before quietly adding, but I'm still only supposed to do it when I'm alone, in a safe place. I smiled, quietly continuing on in silence for some time. Finally, however, I spoke up. Someone, I said, my heart lurching as I made the assertion. There was no turning back now. What? She asked. You asked me if I thought something like you would actually sleep. I paused for a minute before continuing. I think you mean someone. I said the words as I tried to piece together what I was thinking. I believe you're far more human than you give yourself credit for. I believe that if your current situation was different, your actions would be different. I have to believe that you're not the monster you have all the capabilities of being. That just because you can kill doesn't mean you want to. I have to believe that even though you're designed to be like this. My voice faded into nothingness as I picked my next words thoughtfully. I have to believe that design and destiny are not the same. Oh, she stammered. Okay, John. I flinched at my name being uttered. She had said it before, and although I didn't understand why, both times it made my skin crawl. Oh, yeah, I stammered slowly. Why is it that you don't like my name? You kinda fell asleep before you completed that thought. I didn't fall asleep, she again corrected. I sighed. Okay, fine, yeah, I get it. I mean, before you decided to do the other thingy you do. No, she said. I don't think you understand. I think you have misinterpreted me. I didn't choose to go into that state. I looked up at her, confused now. She slowly continued talking as her black hair fell over her face. Something about your name triggered my brain to forcibly attempt to enter recovery mode for the first time since Scatter Protocol. Her cold lips parted again, and what she uttered next made my blood chill. I believe I was trying to reconstruct memories. I've heard your name before.